Right now, your heating is on, or your jacket is zipped up, or there's a roof over your head. You didn't think twice about any of it. But 26,000 years ago, none of those things existed. And the cold wasn't like anything you've ever felt. It was 5 degrees Celsius colder than today, across the entire planet, all at once. The ice sheet stretched from where London now stands all the way to the North Pole, 2 kilometers thick in places. The tundra covered most of Europe and Asia. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, your ancestors were alive, not hiding in a cave waiting for it to pass. Alive, hunting, building, raising children, crossing entire continents. This is not a story about how humans endured the Ice Age. It's a story about how they conquered it. And the answer changes what you think you know about cold, about survival, and about what your body is actually built to do. The Last Glacial Maximum. That's the name scientists give to the coldest period of the last Ice Age. It lasted from roughly 26,500 to 19,000 years ago. Those are the numbers. But numbers don't capture what it actually felt like. The wind chill on the Eurasian steppe could drop exposure times to less than an hour before frostbite set in. Large portions of the northern continents were uninhabitable. The Sahara was not a desert. It was a frozen wasteland. The Amazon had shrunk. Sea levels were 120 meters lower than today because so much of Earth's water was locked inside ice. And yet, humans were everywhere. In 2021, researchers published a landmark study in the journal Science. They had found human footprints preserved in the sediment of White Sands National Park in New Mexico, real footprints, pressed into mud by actual feet. Radiocarbon dating of seeds found in the same layers placed those footprints between 23,000 and 21,000 years ago, directly inside the last glacial maximum. This rewrote what scientists thought they knew. People weren't just surviving somewhere warm. They were crossing Ice Age North America, moving, pushing forward into conditions we would consider unsurvivable today. So how did they do it? The first answer is clothing, and not the kind you're picturing. Not draped fur cloaks. Tailored garments. Complex, multi-layered, precisely sewn clothing with separate sleeves and leggings, hood pieces and boot sections, all fitted close to the body to trap warmth. We know this because of needles. Bone needles. Tiny, eyed, carefully crafted tools made from the long bones of foxes, hares, and small predators. A 2024 study published in PLOS One analyzed bone needles found at the La Prairie archaeological site in Wyoming, dating to roughly 12,900 years ago, using a technique called zooarchaeology by mass spectrometry. A fancy way of saying scientists identified the exact species from protein traces in the bone. Researchers pinpointed where each needle had come from. Fox bones, hare bones, lynx bones, animals trapped for their pelts. The needles were still attached to the pelts, being sewn into garments when they were discarded. The researchers concluded that these weren't simple wraps. They were tailored, fitted, built for survival in intense cold. And we have a ghost of what those garments looked like. In Russia, roughly 200 kilometers east of Moscow, there is a burial site called Sungir. It is approximately 30,000 years old. Inside, archaeologists found the remains of a man and 2 children. Every one of them had been buried in clothing, not the clothing itself, which had long since rotted, but the evidence of clothing. Thousands of ivory beads, still lying in rows where they had been sewn onto garments. More than 13,000 beads in total across 3 burials. Researchers estimated it would have taken at least 10,000 hours to produce them. That is the ghost of an outfit. Someone had spent years decorating the clothes these people wore. And the only reason you spend that kind of time decorating something is if it matters, if it is a statement, if it is culture. These weren't just people surviving the cold. They were doing it in style. But clothing alone wasn't enough. You also needed shelter. And this is where something remarkable happened. In many parts of Ice Age Europe and Asia, there were almost no trees. The tundra was open grassland and frozen earth. Wood was scarce. So your ancestors looked at the largest things around them and they built houses out of them. At a site called Mezherik, in what is now central Ukraine, about 70 miles southeast of Kyiv, archaeologists excavated a set of structures unlike anything else in the ancient world. 4 houses, each one built from mammoth bones. Hundreds of them. Femurs, jawbones, tusks, shoulder blades, all interlocked into circular walls between 12 and 24 square meters in size. A central hearth inside each one. Pits filled with tools just outside. Activity areas laid out with deliberate purpose. A 2025 study led by archaeologist Wei Chu of Leiden University produced new radiocarbon dates for one of these structures. It was built around 18,000 years ago, and it may have been used for up to 429 years. Not a camp, a home, a place people return to across generations. Think about what that required. Someone had to plan the structure. Others had to gather the bones, often from mammoths that had been hunted and butchered elsewhere. Others had to fit them together, covering the dome with hides to seal out wind. Someone had to keep the fire going through the night. None of this was done alone, and that is the part the climate data alone cannot tell you. The part the bones can't show. The single most important survival technology your ancestors had in the Ice Age was not a needle or a bone wall or a fire. It was other people. Here is the evidence. Researchers studying the population structure of Upper Paleolithic humans in Europe found that local groups of 25 to 50 individuals didn't just live together. They maintained active connections across vast distances. Raw materials from quarries hundreds of kilometers away turn up at Ice Age sites. Shells from coastlines appear inland. Amber from the Baltic shows up in southern Ukraine. Ochre pigment traveled across entire landscapes. These weren't accidental trade goods. They were evidence of maintained relationships. People who kept in contact with other groups. People who shared information about where the herds were moving, where the water was unfrozen, which routes were passable. When one group's hunting failed, another group could help. When a region became uninhabitable, people could move toward kin they trusted. In 2012, researchers Sari Apicella, Frank Marlowe, James Fowler, and Nicholas Christakis published a study in the journal Nature examining the social networks of the Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last surviving hunter-gatherer groups on Earth. What they found was that cooperation in these societies didn't spread randomly. It spread through social networks. The people most connected to others were most likely to both give and receive help. Being embedded in a web of relationships wasn't just pleasant. It was the mechanism by which survival was distributed across a group. A single skilled hunter could feed many people. A single family with knowledge of a distant water source could save a band of 30. Connection was survival. Now here is the part nobody tells you about the Ice Age. Most people assume our ancestors retreated, pulled back toward the equator, huddled in small groups at the fringes of the ice, waiting. But that's not what happened. In 2019, researchers studying the Tibetan Plateau found something nobody expected. Human artifacts, including stone tools and red ochre, at a site called Pengbu Wuqing, located 3,800 meters above sea level. Radiocarbon dating placed the occupation during the last glacial maximum itself, the Tibetan Plateau at 3,800 meters elevation, in the coldest period of the last 5 million years. Wenli Li of the University of Chinese Academy of Sciences led the study. The conclusion: humans weren't retreating, they were advancing into terrain that even today would be considered extreme. And here is the twist. For most of the 20th century, scientists believed the Ice Age had temporarily halted human expansion. That population shrank and people retreated to refugia, small livable pockets at lower latitudes, and then re-expanded when the ice receded. The Ice Age was the pause in the human story. But the footprints in New Mexico said otherwise. The bone houses in Ukraine said otherwise. The artifacts on the Tibetan plateau said otherwise. Humans weren't pausing. They were pushing, expanding, innovating. The Ice Age wasn't an obstacle that slowed us down. It was the pressure that made us what we are. The tailored clothing, the long-distance social networks, the bone architecture, the cooperative food sharing, all of it was forged in those 7,000 years of extreme cold. The Ice Age didn't almost stop us. It built us. Think about what your body is doing right now when the temperature drops. You don't have thick fur. Your skin has almost no insulation. Compared to every other large mammal that lived at northern latitudes 25, zeus years ago, you are physically unequipped for the cold, and yet your ancestors lived through the worst of it. Because they solved the cold problem, not with their bodies, but with their minds, with their hands, and their needles, and their social bonds, and their willingness to build something enormous from whatever the landscape gave them. But the story doesn't end there. Because what's most remarkable about the Ice Age isn't the tools or the shelters. It's a question researchers have only recently started asking seriously. Why did some human populations expand into the worst conditions imaginable while others pulled back? Why push forward into the frozen unknown when retreat was an option? The answer, written into the bones and the artifacts and the footprints, points to something that is not survival at all. It points to something that looks more like curiosity. At Sungir, those 13,000 beads didn't keep anyone warm. The years of skilled labor embedded in a dead child's burial clothing, that wasn't survival calculus. That was something else. That was meaning-making. The urge to mark a life as significant. To say this person mattered, to carry grief and love forward through time. That impulse shows up everywhere in the Ice Age record. The paintings inside Chauvet Cave in France, some of the most sophisticated animal art ever made, date to approximately 36,000 years ago. The artists who made them lived with glaciers on the horizon. They went underground, in the dark, with simple fat lamps, and painted horses and lions and rhinoceroses in motion, with depth and perspective and emotional accuracy on surfaces that no one may have seen again for tens of thousands of years. They weren't surviving. They were living. And maybe that distinction is the real answer to how they made it through, not just the needles or the networks or the bone walls. The refusal to treat survival as the only goal. The insistence, even in the worst conditions the planet had ever thrown at our species, that beauty and meaning and connection were also necessary. Were not luxuries. Were, in fact, the thing that made all the other things possible. The coldest period in 2.5 million years. And your ancestors used it to make art. You've had the heating on this whole time, and you still forgot you were cold.